we are finishing, Charles. We would like to know now your opinion about cognitive science. Your opinion in deep.
Well, and there are some pieces of it that I mean, there's lots of beautiful research by cognitive people, but they don't appreciate contingencies. They build computer programs, and so they become very good at teaching computers, but they have not become very good at teaching kids. They've got the wrong subjects. They should be learning how to teach. We know how to teach kids. If we can get a kid on the autism spectrum who is nonverbal to start speaking words, we should be able to teach any kid. But the educational systems, I don't know what your systems are like, but as I look around and see what's going on, some places do better than others. It's very hard to make inroads in educational systems that have all kinds of, I have to say, primitive ways of thinking about how behavior works. And we've got to educate them, and that's hard to do. The other thing about cognitive science is they really don't have a unified way of thinking about what they do that's agreed upon. We have a certain set of things. We know what kinds of expectations we have of our students when they go through any kind of accreditation for doing applied work. And that's shaky because at first it was an American enterprise, and then there were international kinds of things. But accreditation did get going in Europe, and it's now more on its own, which is maybe a good thing because variations are good. When I did an early version of my learning book, I tried to include cognitive topics in it. And so I had chapters on visualization and these other sorts of things. And there was and one early edition was reviewed by a woman who was a cognitive psychologist. And it was a very favorable review with respect to the parts about behavior analysis. But essentially her review said that when I was trying to deal with the cognitive things, that I just didn't get it. And after the review came out, I met her at a professional meeting. I think it was the American Psychological Association. And I started asking her what things about cognitive psychology I had missed. And she said, well, I really can't tell you exactly, but there's this person you might talk to. And at first I was kind of depressed by that. But the more I thought about it, the more I said, well, wait a minute, here I am. I'm an interested audience. I want to understand what these other folks are doing. And here's a person who's reasonably prominent enough to be asked to review this book of mine. And I'm asking that person what I need to know. And she can't tell me. She can't tell me what it is about cognitive science that I missed. And maybe the problem is with cognitive science, because they can't say what they all have in common. And in fact, if you get different cognitive science textbooks, you have they different kinds of emphases. Some are emphasizing certain kinds of problem solving, and some are emphasizing machine-human interactions. Maybe the problem is that they haven't decided yet what their field is really about. They're interested in studying the mind. I was involved in a conference once, which was in linguistics. It was, again, a language evolution conference at Harvard. Hadn't been back there for a long time. And the principal speaker was Jack Andoff, who at that time I think was the president of some maybe national linguistic organization. And he gave his invited address, and it was a very large auditorium. Chomsky was there. Daniel Dennett was there. There were prominent figures in psychology and in linguistics. And during his talk, he talked about modules, language modules. And one module was replication kind of thing, like the sort of thing I talked about with respect to the textual behavior and taking dictation and those kinds of things. Another module was primitive things like grunts and ejaculation, the ouch and things like that, single word utterances. Some other things had to do with giving instructions to other people, and some had to do with making connections with things in the world. My son had been a student at UMass and had been to a talk that this guy had given, and this guy usually went out for beer afterwards. And my son, in talking to him, found that he said he had read Skinner's verbal behavior at some point, which I thought was kind of interesting. Anyway, I just decided, what the hell? They had people going around up and down this was a very big auditorium with microphones if you wanted to ask a question. So I raised my hand and I took the microphone and I said, I find all of this very interesting, but there was an American psychologist who also had a modular theory of language. And he had some modules that were had these properties, and he had names for them and modules in it. And I talked for a little bit, and then I said, you may have guessed by now that the person I'm talking about is B.F. Skinner. The verbal classes that he described are very much like the modules you've described. And I said that having heard from my son that Jack and Dolph had read Skinner's verbal behavior at one time. And I then finished my thing and gave the mic back, and he picked up his mic and he said, well, yes, of course there are these similarities, but Skinner was only interested in behavior. I'm interested in the mind. And that was it. Well, I later talked to someone else, maybe it was Daniel Dennett, who, by the way, still hadn't read verbal behavior. And then it said that was an interesting ploy. You gave the impression and you got the attention of the audience because it seemed like you wanted to make this point, but you'd temporarily forgotten the name of the speaker. And when you finally dropped Skinner's name, that really kind of made it clear that had not been the case, that you said this like that. So that was all kind of fun. But the important part of it was, there you've got the same kinds of things, and yet somehow you're interested in this thing. You're not interested in behavior. You're not even saying that verbal behavior is behavior. You're interested in this thing called the mind. I don't know what the future is for that way of thinking about things. And that's what makes me feel somewhat optimistic. I think that some of these things will eventually just fall by the wayside, because where do you ever go with them? We at least start with this notion that we have learned all the words about our thinking and our imagining and our dreaming from other people. And the only way they could have taught us that is if they had access to our behavior. They couldn't get inside. They can't see what we're doing in there any more than, and therefore, since our vocabulary was taught with respect to the stuff that was public and eventually got extended to the stuff that was private, we know better the stuff that's there in the environment than we do about what's going on inside our own heads. And until the cognitive psychologists understand that, I don't see how they can ever get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry if you're out there and you're listening and you're a cognitive psychologist. This, I think, is a problem you've got to deal with.
Maybe they can say it to us in the comments below the video. So, well,